call this September 4th, 2019 meeting of the James City County Planning Commission to order. Mr. Holt, would you please call the roll?
Ms. Dowdy.
Here.
Ms. Dowdy represents the Stonehouse District. Ms. Leverins.
Here.
Ms. Leverins is an at-large member. Mr. Polster.
Here.
Mr. Polster represents the Jamestown District. Mr. Schmidt.
Here.
Mr. Schmidt represents the Roberts District. Mr. O'Connor.
Here.
Mr. O'Connor is an at-large member. Mr. Kropf.
Here.
Mr. Kropf represents the Powhatan District and is this year's vice chair. Mr. Haldeman.
Here.
Mr. Haldeman represents the Berkeley District and is this year's chairman. I'm Paul Holt, Director of Community Development and Planning for the county. And sitting to my left is the distinguished Adam Kinsman, our county attorney. Mr. Chairman, we have a quorum.
Thank you very much. We now have time for public comment. This is for topics not subject to a public hearing. Speakers are limited to 3 minutes. Do we have any speaker cards? Seeing none, would anybody like to address the commission? Seeing no one, we'll move on to reports of the commission. The Development Review Committee, Mr. Polster, please.
Thank you. I'd like to make a correction on my report when I called it the design review as opposed to the development review, and I thank Danny Schmidt for that correction, even though he agrees that it should be design, I think.
Design works too.
The Development Review Committee met at 4 p.m. on the 21st of August, 2019. Committee members present were Odessa Dottie, Jack Haldeman, Danny Schmidt, Frank Polster. Staff members present were Tom Leninger, planner, Juan Carlos Morgado, stormwater, and applicants Ben Volmer and Joe Davis from the Strata Solar Development, and Adam Pratt from Kaufman and Canolis. C19-0041 Hill Pleasant Farm Solar Farm was presented to the DRC as a conceptual plan for a special use permit for a solar farm located at 7150 Richmond Road. The applicant has applied for AFD 19-00 to be removed. That's 192.76 acres from the AFD, and that the case will be presented to the Planning Commission separately. The parcels are designated economic development by the 2035 Comprehensive Plan. The applicant requested the item on the DRC calendar to discuss the project and seek input and questions from the DRC members. No action by the DRC was required. Questions from Mr. Haldeman revolved on special use conditions from a previous solar farm application in Norwich and the willingness to conform to those same requirements like a nutrient management plan and buffering requirements. The applicant described the 50-foot buffer along the CSX rail line and Route 60 that, given the elevation of the rail line and the height of the mixed plantings, of the concept of planting pollinator-friendly plants among the solar panels. Mr. Polster endorsed that idea and suggested that and added that an SUB condition could be for an agricultural best management practice, stipulating planting pollinator-friendly plants. The applicant agreed in principle, but the extent of the plantings in the project area would be determined at the design review stage. The lease agreement for the property is for 30 years with extensions of 5-year increments. Mr. Haldeman had a hypothetical situation where Strata was bought out by another firm halfway through their lease agreement. The question was, could the new firm unilaterally terminate the lease and use it for some other purpose? The reply was yes, with the agreement of both parties. Mr. Polster asked Strata if the lease agreement required them to budget for the removal and restoration of the land at the end of the lease. Strata replied that they do. Mr. Juan Carlos Morgado from the Stormwater Division asked about the sediment control plan for the project's nutrient reduction requirements. The applicant responded that the preliminary design called for a series of dry swales along the perimeter, as shown in the draft schematic of the project. They added that the ecological consultant had just completed their survey, which may lead to additional best management practices. Mr. Polster expressed a concern on the retention of the remaining 190 acres in the Hillcrest Farm AFD, since it was not been farmed for the last 10 years. It also appeared that a considerable portion of the acreage was in the resource protection area and could not be developed. Strata had recently updated their survey of the project and agreed to provide the resource protection area acreage for the retained AFD land. Staff previously said that the removing of the entire 391 acres from the AFD would cause the district to drop below the minimum 200 acres required for an AFD district. Mr. Polster suggested this could be overcome by the inclusion of the remaining AFD properties included in the nearby Croker AFD. The consensus of the DRC was supportive of the Strata Solar Farm proposal. Members commented on the positive reputation of the firm and the solar industry, applauded the movement toward greenness with renewable energy sources. that this was a preferable alternative to development and were positive on the addition of an SUB condition for an agricultural best management practice of planting pollinator-friendly plants among the solar panels.
Thank you. Any questions of Mr. Polster? With that, Policy Committee, Ms. Leverance.
The Policy Committee met on August 8th, 2019. Committee members present were Jack Haldeman, Rich Kropf, Tim O'Connor, and Julia Leverance. Staff members present were Christy Parrish and John Reisinger. Ms. Parrish presented for Stage 1 committee consideration proposed ordinance amendments to regulate the keeping of inoperable motor vehicles on residential, commercial, and agricultural properties less than 2 acres in size. At the county's request, the General Assembly has granted an amendment to the county charter allowing the definition of inoperable vehicle on properties less than 2 acres to include vehicles that are not in operating condition, not shielded from view, and have either invalid license plates or an invalid inspection decal. Previously, the definition required both expired missing plates and decal. The amendment also allows the county to regulate inoperable vehicles on agricultural properties that are 2 acres or less. Ms. Parrish also asked the committee for comments on regulating oversized commercial vehicles in areas zoned residential. Staff have received concerns and complaints over the years, and the zoning ordinance does not currently address this issue. She presented examples of regulations from other localities. The committee discussed the types of vehicles that would be considered oversized versus work vehicles used by the residential owner. We asked about the legality of regulating oversized vehicles in private driveways, whether commercial would include recreational vehicles, and if the planning director could designate particular neighborhoods to prohibit parking oversized commercial vehicles on the street. Ms. Parrish explained the jurisdiction for inoperable and oversized vehicles on private property, which is zoning administration, public right-of-way, the police department, and maintaining access for emergency vehicles, the fire department. Ms. Parrish will coordinate with the police, fire, and legal departments while drafting proposed ordinances for Stage 2 committee consideration.
Thank you. Any questions on policy? Thank you very much. Moving on to the consent agenda. There are 2 items this evening. The consent agenda items are determined to be non-controversial. However, a planning commissioner can pull any item for discussion. Would anyone like to pull an item? Or may I please have a motion to approve?
Motion to approve the consent agenda, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Public hearings. We have one tonight, case number ORD-19-0001, zoning ordinance amendment to section 2416, proffer of conditions. Mr. Holt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. Good evening. Just real briefly, this item should look very familiar to you. This item was previously considered by the commission back on June the 5th. Since that time, in continuing work with the county attorney's office, the proposed ordinance amendment has been updated to more specifically reference the applicable state code section. And because that was deemed to be a significant change, it was remanded back to the Planning Commission for some additional consideration. Other than that, there are no proposed other changes or differences from the version you saw last time. This is really a reference in the code that would allow the county to start offers again. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions.
Any questions of Mr.?
Do I understand that this ordinance for the proffers does not apply to archaeology or to recreation or to the roads, that this is primarily associated with proffers for school? Is that correct?
So right now, the way the ordinance reads is the county will not accept proffers for any proposed projects that are for new residential development or have a residential component. This change doesn't specifically address any one impact. This change is really amending part of the code that just generally will allow proffers to be submitted again. So when we get to a point in the analysis of an application, when one comes in, if there are anticipated impacts, say, to archaeology or to roadways, proffers can then be submitted to try to mitigate those. So for those policies that were rescinded previously by the board. This change in the zoning ordinance doesn't put those back. Again, we can't still have written proffer policies. This is just a generic code reference, so.
Just as a follow-up, I thought that we had placed those at least 3 or 4 items already into ordinances, so that we, in fact, came up with a policy so that we wouldn't have to worry about the proffer because there was already boilerplate in the language.
We did, and that's an excellent point, and thank you for that. So yes, many items that historically we had received only through proffers, archaeology, accommodations for pedestrians, bicycles, street trees. Over these last couple of years, we have had the opportunity to move those requirements into the zoning ordinance, and we've done some other things regarding transportation, a new transportation adequacy test. But again, there are some things off-site that can't be accomplished in the zoning ordinance. So there were many things that we had historically received proffers for that we weren't able to build into the ordinance. So this would allow some of those impacts to be mitigated again.
So besides schools, are we talking about affordable housing? Falls in that category?
It could be off-site transportation-related impacts. It could be impacts to the JCSA system. It could be anything as a result of the proposed development.
I'm surprised that you said JCSA. I mean, there's us that I thought were already a part of the ordinances that they had to come up with.
Not always. I mean, there are still tap fees and those types of things, but, you know, if there is, say, for instance, an off-site pump station that needs to be upgraded, for example, that could be an example. Something
I was
that
just trying to
affects the
understand
supply
what this was
system.
going to apply to, and then what was left over from what we've already done in the last 2 years, and trying to assess what the impact was if we didn't do this.
Any other questions? Mr. Holt? Any disclosures? I gather not. That, I'll open the public hearing. There is no applicant. Close the public hearing.
Correct. I don't have any speaker cards.
Close the public hearing with no speaker cards. Discussion by commissioners.
Well, I'll start off. As you all know, when we saw this before, I was against it. And I was against it really for 2 reasons. It was the ambiguousness of the language in terms of what was applicable and the lack of any definitions of what that meant. So that when we received something of a proffer, how would we determine whether it was applicable in terms of the offer? I've gone through a series of email exchanges with Mr. Kinsman this afternoon, which I think you may have seen. And I think I'm satisfied with the fact that there are some new procedures that will be put in place that address those concerns and applicability of that. So with those sort of discussion pieces, I now would support it.
I remain convinced that this is not the right time, if there ever is one. This would be a terrible mistake to reinstate proffers at this time. I'm not going to rehash all the reasons that I went through at the last meeting. I have a couple of new concerns. We have, since that meeting, learned that, or seen the results of a survey attendant to the comprehensive plan. 93% of our fellow residents think we have enough or too much residential housing already. That's as close to unanimous as anything in this country since I think George Washington was elected president. We know from the housing conditions study that there are already platted 11,000 more home sites. If you figure in 2.5 people per home site, we're already plugged in for another 25 or 26,000 people in James City County, taking us over 100,000. Housing conditions study, along with the comprehensive plan, the strategic plan, the workforce housing task force report, the business climate task force report, all warn of the negative impacts of this kind of growth on our economy and on our environment and on our quality of life. So I think that not only would this be a bad time to reinstate proffers for those reasons, I think it would also be a breach of trust or breach of faith with our residents. We also know that the past proffer policy did not come close to mitigating the expense and the pernicious effects of sprawl development. We have no reserves from past proffers to cover the cost of those 11,000 new families. We have, the proffers did not adequately plan for the traffic. I think we've all seen that, or the school growth, or the pollution to our streams. At the last meeting on this subject, we heard Mr. Halavin say that although some of the risks from the first legislation were eliminated, not all of them, there are still additional risks from the second that have survived the second legislation. And I don't know why we would want to incur that. I've reviewed the discussion at our last June 5th meeting on the efficacy and enforcement of easements versus proffers and come away with two conclusions. I'm convinced easements are just as enforceable as proffers. And the subject is almost moot, as there has only been one new residential rezoning application that used an easement since proffers were eliminated 3+ years ago. Either demand for new development has dropped since the new policy was implemented, or the new policy has been effective in stifling further sprawl. In short, we don't have a housing opportunities policy anymore. We don't, the workforce housing task force report hasn't been digested, and recommendations have not been adopted. So that if somebody wanted to make a proffer, we wouldn't have any basis for accepting it or not. The strategic plan, as you know, is just beginning its revision process. It's just hard for me to understand why go ahead with the proffer policy at this time with all of these things up in the air. So I plan to vote no.
Just as an aside, in my opinion, the issue of residential growth, which I do think is a serious concern, and the issue of mitigating that growth, in essence, have two separate tracks. And as I mentioned during our June meeting, when the county decided not to accept proffers for residential rezonings, applicants just found ways to work around that were, in my opinion, a bit more cumbersome. And so I look at it, and I will support this this change, but I look at it, it does provide a tool to help mitigate some of the effects of growth, whether it be proffering a tapered turn lane into a development, or, you know, as some of these other policies get fleshed out, the ones that you referred to, it provides, in my opinion, a tool that's easier to manage than easements. And, you know, under the former proffer policy, we were able to accept contributions for affordable housing if a development wasn't including a certain type of housing. And so I just felt that the proffers provided a little more flexibility to be able to mitigate. And as I saw from the email exchanges this afternoon, there's no hard and fast definition. And I know that's where it gets a little squishy as far as what is the consideration of an adverse impact and what's the degree of adversity for that impact. But I feel that not having proffers might encourage more residential growth or encourage workarounds. So that's why I'd be supporting this tonight.
Further discussion?
I would just offer that I think I'm very much aligned with Mr. Kropp. Probably one of the few who didn't agree with accepting no proffers at all. I think proffers are a tool. I think they're a right of the property holder. I don't I, for one, don't characterize all growth as sprawl, and I look at proffers as a way to help allow us to have that discussion with the development community to understand how growth can be mitigated, whether it's physical or monetary or the like. So I believe proffers are a tool. I believe they're a good tool. I believe it allows us to engage with the developer. I feel that by not taking proffers that we were truly handcuffed, and it may have been a tool to disallow growth, but again, the alternative just becomes by right growth. And to me, I think having by right growth without a plan leads to sprawl. So that's just.
Ms. Leverance?
These are all very good points, and I'm vacillating back and forth. But as I understand, as part of the comprehensive plan process, we are going to be working towards quantifying impacts. Is that a fair statement? So on the one hand, with Mr. Haldeman, it's like, why shouldn't we wait until we do have quantifiable data with which to assess whether something is adequate or not? But on the other hand, then we have Mr. Kropp's argument that people will find workarounds, and that is true. So I'm inclined to support this with the understanding that we will have better tools once we have quantifiable data to back them up.
Further discussion? Please have a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I'll move approval of case number ORD-19-001, zoning ordinance amendment to section 24-16, proffer of conditions.
Mr. Holt, please call the roll.
Ms. Dowdy?
Aye.
Ms. Leverance?
Aye.
Mr. Polster?
Aye.
Mr. Schmidt?
Aye.
Mr. O'Connor?
Aye.
Mr. Kropp?
Aye.
And Mr. Haldeman?
No.
Motion carries.
Thank you. Moving on to Planning Commission considerations, item number Z-19-0011, Mason Park Proffer Amendment. Mr. Roberto, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Planning Commission. Mr. Jonathan Kramer of H. Hunt Homes has submitted a request to amend proffers for Mason Park adopted in 2006. The applicant is proposing to delete reference to detached garages from the adopted proffers to allow the construction of residential units with attached garages. In 2006, the approximately 9.11 acre property located at 1916 Jamestown Road was rezoned from R8, Rural Residential District, to R2, General Residential, with proffers, along with the special use permit for a cluster overlay and a request for a reduced street width. Mason Park was approved as a residential development with 15 single-family detached units with detached garages and a gross density of 1.65 dwelling units per acre. According to the applicant, the proposed amendment reflects a preference in the current housing market for residential units with attached garages. No further changes are requested by the applicant. Staff does not anticipate additional impacts to be generated by this proffer amendment. The comprehensive plan designates this property as low-density residential and establishes residential land use standards, which, among other elements, encourage locating garages at the rear or side of the dwelling units in order to de-emphasize the prominence of the garage and associated driveway. With the proposed change, the garages would no longer be detached structures, but they would still be consistent with this language by being located at the rear of the dwellings. The adopted master plan for this proposal also placed garages at the rear of dwelling units. Staff finds the proposal to be compatible with surrounding development and consistent with the adopted comprehensive plan and zoning ordinance. Staff recommends the Planning Commission recommend approval of this application and acceptance of the amended proffers to the Board of Supervisors. At this time, we'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. The applicant is also in attendance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Any questions of Mr. Roberto? Ms. Leverance?
Presumably, this will create a tiny bit more green space for each lot?
We haven't really looked into the
All be one patch.
minor
We're
detail.
not breaking up the green space this way.
potentially.
Other questions? Thank you very much. Discussion by commissioners. Discussion? Not, may I have a motion to approve?
Move approval of JCCZ. Don't take that away. Motion approval of Planning Commission consideration Z 19-0011 Mason Park Proffer Amendment.
All in favor?
I need to do a roll call.
Beg your
Yes,
pardon.
that-
Mr. Holt?
That's all right. Ms. Dowdy?
Aye.
Ms. Leverins?
Aye.
Mr. Polster?
Aye.
Mr. Schmidt?
Aye.
Mr. O'Connor?
Aye.
Mr. Crop?
Aye.
And Mr. Haldeman?
Aye.
Thank you, motion carries.
Thank you. Planning Director's report. Mr. Holt, you've been busy tonight.
I have been, thank you very much. That's okay. That's all right. There's always stuff to do, for sure. Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, other than what's been included in your packets, I don't have anything new or additional to add tonight, but I'd be happy to take any questions.
Question? Seeing none, we'll move on to Planning Commission discussion. Mr. Crop, you have board coverage?
Yes, sir.
September the 10th.
On September 10th.
Thank you very much. Anything else for the good of the cause?
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. Okay. Just that some of you, maybe this was before you came on the commission, but we, for years, had the, on the CIP list, it was one of our elementary schools, and just happens to be the one my kids go to, so I'm seeing this firsthand, where Matthew Whaley Elementary went from gravel to paved, and it just happened this summer. But I'm kind of hitting myself for never during those meetings asking the question if the number of parking spaces would go down. It's gone way down. And so now staff that are, buildings and grounds are now being pulled away. You got 3 of them out there directing traffic for 30 minutes in the morning and 30 minutes in the afternoon. So why am I telling you this story? I guess going forward, whenever you're a part of the CIP process and they talk about a parking lot in a school, make sure to ask that question, are we going to have the same amount of parking spaces after it's redone? Okay.
Why would paving it reduce the,
Paving it was, the gravel, I guess, was an issue. Like if it snowed or something, you couldn't really plow. And there were other, hydrology issues. So they said they were going to pave it. And I think you may have been in some of those meetings. And I believe we probably just assumed, well, we'll have the same amount of spaces after the gravel goes to asphalt. But they now sort of medians and little sort of, curbs and stuff that took away a ton of spots. So I would guess it's a net loss of around 20. But it's chaos. And I know this is the first week, but I don't see it getting better because there's no space for people coming in to drop off and pick up kids. And that used to work without staff being pulled out. So anybody from schools is watching, there's a problem in Matthew Whaley. But yeah, just going forward, I don't think any of us asked that, and I certainly didn't. So.
Ms. Leverins?
Call our attention to the public comment and things we've seen about short-term rental housing and concerns in the community that the proliferation of these might turn our community into something we don't necessarily want it to be. So I think that that's something that we probably should look into from the standpoint of, do we need new policies? Do we need some standards?
It was an interesting email, but I think my first initial thought was, I was in Virginia Beach some this week actually, is that we're not Virginia Beach. So, I don't think people come for big parties near, the Tri-Corner
Wasn't there
Hat
one,
area.
was it like Scottsdale, Arizona or someplace?
Oh, was there?
also a concern?
Maybe I missed one. I was thinking of the Sandbridge one.
There was something in the, I think it was a letter to the editor or the last word.
Okay, I didn't see that one. But yeah, no, we need to put serious consideration to that per our discussions with Mr. O'Connor last month, for sure.
Thank you.
I wasn't sure with those set of articles that were in that on the issue of sunset clause, whether they quoted you correctly by saying, Paul, that you didn't think that we could place a sunset clause. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. Because remember, zoning runs with the land, And, you know, again, can't really tie SUP conditions to a particular owner. So traditionally, we have, except if the use is a temporary use, there's very few of those, then traditionally we have not looked to place sunset clauses.
Was there any alternatives?
Could we say that a guest or room rentals could be a temporary use and sort of define those as temporary uses?
I don't think so. I mean, that opens a pretty big door. I mean, the way the code is set up right now, once an SUP is granted, the board is really the only ones with the ability to revoke an SUP. There really isn't a mechanism in place for an interim review or some other renewal.
Unless it was an SUP condition, correct? That the board signed off on.
I don't think so. I think that's, you know, I won't play lawyer, but we have the best one here.
Consider if it's a special use permit that's granted and something was going wrong, a citizen could complain about the special use permit. It goes to our zoning administrator who determines whether or not there's a violation of the condition, and the board could actually revoke the SUP. So it's sort of implicitly in there.
Okay.
There are definitely, Mr. Polster, there are definitely two schools of thought from county attorneys as to whether sunset clauses are appropriate in all cases or not. I fall into the group that says that they're not. The Virginia Code is very explicit, and it says when a BZA grants an SUP, which our BZA doesn't do, you guys do, it's very explicit, and it says they can put sunset clauses on things. That does not contained in the Planning Commission's part of the Virginia Code. So I read that to mean it's excluded from the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission's abilities and the board's ability. I will tell you that there are other attorneys, and it's a good argument, that said if the BZA can do it, surely a Board of Supervisors can do it. But it's not in there, and so I read it to say that we can't. I've been swayed, and we've done some sunset clauses for truly temporary uses, borrow pits. I think I might have been convinced to do one for a daycare, but I think I did it over protest. So far, the only one I've been really comfortable with is a borrow pit.
I think the issue, when we look at the number of properties that are probably in the James City County area, about 300 or so, majority of them are in the timeshare area. And, that's a different set of problems. It's the ones that are in the residential areas that were brought up by the Scottsdale piece, as well as in the Virginia Beach area. And so it almost sounded like that from both those articles that the residents could complain, but it becomes an habitual problem with the police and all the rest of it to try to do something. So if there is a way for the zoning board to be able to do something, maybe that's a different approach to the issue.
We really have the ultimate control over them where they're not permitted. It's an SUP. So each one of them is individually considered with individual conditions specific to that particular piece of property. Of course, where they're permitted as a matter of right, you don't have that. So that's going to be what, your R4,
Or five.
R5.
P.
There's a few districts.
Mixed
So,
use.
yeah, you're looking at like Green Springs, West, Plantation. I mean,
Yeah,
there's a lot of R4.
The master plan communities, Kings Mill, Ford's Colony, they're all allowed by right.
So if it ends up being a problem there, you'd have to think about a change to our zoning ordinance that doesn't allow them as a matter of right there. But where you have to come in and get in a special use permit, they're each getting individual attention. And if there's a problem, they can be individually dealt with.
But the fail-safe, and I think Mr. Holt just alluded to this, is local government still does have a lot of power. So if it starts to become like a broad issue, the Board of Supervisors, couldn't they, in theory, go into one, take maybe case by case, but all right, that's gone. Take away that from I think you alluded to that.
Well, if they've been granted an SUP, then they've got a right to continue it absent a violation of that SUP. But you could certainly change the code to say that we no longer allow them. They become a non-conforming use, and then
Well, that's what I was
ultimately
saying.
sort of
If there are like
weed them out.
a fair amount of bad apples out there, but enough so that it becomes a countywide problem or a neighborhood
I'd say to date, our
problem.
only complaints have been ones that are not permitted. Is that
There's
fair,
probably
Paul?
a majority of them are sneaking it by.
Try to go after them.
I think the daycare had a special exception. The board had really wanted to give the property owner a little bit of time to work with the neighborhood to change the covenants, and that's sort of an extended process there, which sort of led to that particular extenuating circumstance. So, as I
In regards to the email that you brought up, Julia, I think that Sandbridge and Virginia, it's such a different animal. People, there's so many resorts here. People visit for a completely different reason. And I definitely agree that it's something that we need to look into. But I don't foresee that being, wild part, things that they're, in the email that the citizen was concerned about. But, there are policies and things like that that, need to be put in place.
Further discussion
Not on that topic.
or any topic?
Yeah, I found the Mason Park proffer discussion, not discussion, but a proffer amendment interesting. And I don't know, Mr. Holt, you can tell us whether it's a policy committee or a comp plan discussion moving forward, but I manage properties from here to Northern Virginia, and find it very interesting that, we have these streetscape and these design guidelines and all these pieces that say, we want to de-emphasize the garage, and emphasize the entry. And what I find is when we create these alleyways and put garages to the rear of the homes, what I'm finding is we get more narrow streets in the front, we get alleys in the back, and especially in detached garages, they really become sheds, and everybody parks in front of the house on the narrow streets. There's not enough room for cars to get by. We have these great, streetscape ideas, but it doesn't really conform or doesn't really agree with the way people live and use their homes. So, I think it's a worthy discussion, because what I found interesting about the Mason Park piece is, we talked about de-emphasizing driveways as part of that discussion, but we almost took over the entire yard with a driveway to get to the rear of the unit. So I think I would like to have the conversation as we go. I think there's ways to de-emphasize. We did it at the Candle Factory property, with side loading garages, and so we ended up with smaller driveways, and we eliminated the alleys. And so if we're talking about pervious versus impervious surfaces, I think there's a way to do all these things and use construction techniques to de-emphasize garages. So, I had an interesting conversation with the builder the other day about water conservation techniques, and, able to save 8,000 gallons a year on a home by having recirculating pumps. So, there's things that I would like to see with building techniques and parts in the comp plan update that we could look at to incentivize or to attack some of these design guidelines that we have. Go ahead.
Thanks. Further discussion? Motion to adjourn. All in favor?
Aye.
Meeting adjourned?